From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Just 8 days to the consequential midterm elections. Where do things stand? Welcome to a special edition of Potomac Watch today, in which a special guest will enlighten us. I'm Kim Strassel, and I'm here today with the famous Karl Rove, Senior Advisor and Deputy Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, author, Fox News contributor, and, of course, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Karl.
Great to be here. Thanks for letting me on.
Yeah, I've got to tell listeners this story. You know it already, but Wednesday night is the worst night of my week, and that is because of you. So some people might know that my column appears online Thursday and in the paper on Friday. Yours appears online Wednesday and in the paper on Thursday. And now every Wednesday night, I sit down, I read your column, and one of two things happens. I either say, oh my God, I should have written that column. Or I say, oh my God, why didn't I think of writing that? And every Wednesday night is ruined, thanks to you.
For the listeners, you need to know that I did receive a phone call from Kim, who said that she was going to complain to the upper hierarchy of the Wall Street Journal and asked that I be moved to earlier in the week so she would have more time to prepare her column and less competition for me. But, you're fully capable of generating an incredibly well-read and well-researched column. And I'm just glad that I've got between your Friday column and my following Thursday column to recover.
That's very, very kind. Okay, let's just start. Obviously, we are 8 days out from the midterms. Let's talk a little bit about closing themes. You've got Republicans. They seem to be making some ground on the economy, crime, inflation, the issues that really matter to Americans and their pocketbooks at the moment. Democrats have continued to campaign on abortion, GOP extremism, to the extent that they are talking about the economy. It's Joe Biden over the weekend saying that things are looking really good. Do you think anyone's buying that? Where do things stand at the moment with these closing arguments?
Yeah, look, I'm mystified by the Democrats on the economy. First of all, they ignored it for July and August and most of September, if not into October. And then the president sort of decided it was good news week. So, our economy is strong as hell, he said, and made other similar comments that are just so much at odds with the felt experience of the average American family. They got to fill up the car and it costs a lot. They're going to the grocery store and the things they used to buy are now getting priced out. They had to send the kids back to school and buy new clothes and equipment to take to school. And all of that was far more expensive. And we've had 18 months in which real wages have declined. And so they get a paycheck and it just doesn't seem to stretch as far as it did. So the president coming in and saying, we're strong as hell and we've solved all these problems and built on his earlier comments that inflation was going to be transitory and so forth, it makes him seem out of touch. So here at the end, we do have a number of Democrats who are starting to talk about inflation and the economy. But if they're cheerleading, it ain't working very well. And if they're not cheerleading, they're being smart.
Yeah, and now we have this new thing that's been thrown in the middle. As everyone knows, Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, was brutally attacked in his home, their home, by a suspect that supposedly was looking for her. This is really a horrible, horrible news. Any type of political violence is intolerable. And we've seen it growing, targeting politicians on all sides of the spectrum and Supreme Court justices. But Karl, Democrats have really jumped on this and argued that this just underlines Republican extremism. They're suggesting that the GOP is responsible for this because Nancy Pelosi features in some of their ads actually calling on the GOP to take those down. Do you think this is going to play into the election? How should we be looking at this?
First of all, let me say Paul Pelosi, I know him. He's a wonderful man, a gentleman in the true sense of the word. This was a heinous attack, and I'm so relieved that the police responded so quickly and that the prognosis seems to be so good for Paul. He's such a fine guy. And I can just imagine Nancy Pelosi and Paul and Nancy's children, the angst that they've had about their father. And this is a sickness that is in our society. We ought to, though, stay away from trying to turn this into partisan points to rescue a failing political campaign. I mean, the attack on Brett Kavanaugh, foiled by a sick person calling the police and letting them know what he was up to. The assault when Steve Scalise was nearly killed, and other members of the House Republican baseball team, some of whom are my fellow Texans, members of Congress from Texas who play on that team. I'm thinking of Roger Williams and Kevin Brady, both of whom were there. It would have been just as inappropriate for the Republicans to say to the Democrats, you need to pull down your ads and you need to apologize for this, as some of these calls today by Democrats. Let's stay focused on Paul Pelosi and getting him back united with his family in good health.
Yes, well said. And let's hope we continue to see all the political sphere appropriately condemning this when it happens in any form of fashion, because we need to lower the rhetoric a little bit all around. Let's turn to the Senate. For the last couple of weeks, the polls have really shown a shift where Republicans have been making gains in the seats that they really needed to hold. And it looked as though they were also closing the gap in some of these states they need to pick up, places like Pennsylvania, Arizona. I noticed there's a new round of New York Times Siena polls out today that, in fact, are suggesting that in some of those states that Democrats still have quite substantial leads, in particular Pennsylvania, which is interesting because John Fetterman just had that pretty terrible debate there. Georgia, Arizona. Are the polls off here, Karl? What do you see happening in the Senate? Is the GOP still actually things moving in their direction?
I believe so. Look, at the end of a campaign, the natural gravitational forces tend to take over. And in this campaign, when you got less than a quarter of the American people thinking the country is going in the right direction and 3/4 thinking it's seriously off on the wrong track, when you've got poor rankings for the president, not only generally, but particularly upon inflation and the economy. To me, one of the interesting questions that gets asked, has been asked for, I think, 80 years, and that is the question in Gallup, which party do you think will do a better job of handling the most important problem you think there is? That's 48R, 37D. And just all of that gravitational influence here at the end is going to move towards the Republicans. Now, does it move a lot? I don't know. Does it move a little? No, I don't know, but it moves. And with the races having been consistently as close as they have been, any movement at all can help bring some people across the line.
Yeah, let's go through some of the states. It seems as though the states that Republicans really need to keep, they're looking better in a number of them. Ron Johnson up in Wisconsin, he's consistently ahead in the polls now, in some of them by 3, 4, 5. North Carolina, you see the same thing. Ohio, J.D. Vance, after a long fought race there and a lot of money on both sides, he seems to be looking more comfortable. What do you see, Karl, and in some of these places where the GOP is going to need to do some pickups if they want to actually end up with control, and also some places they simply need to hold, like Pennsylvania?
Yeah, well, look, let's first of all take the states to hold. I think you're absolutely right. Florida, Marco Rubio is opening up a lead. I feel good about Ted Budd in North Carolina. Ron Johnson is going to run strong in Wisconsin. Ohio, you're right. In full disclosure, J.D. Vance, a group that I'm connected with, the American Crossroads Senate Leadership Fund, is spending $35 million in Ohio. So that state went for Trump by a bigger margin than did Texas. So I think at the end of the day, he wins. And then, of course, the key one there is going to be Pennsylvania. And the movement has been, I think, in Mehmet Oz's direction. The question is, do his lines and John Fetterman's lines cross before Election Day, and does he win? And I think he, at the end of the day, does pick it up and keep the victory in the Republican side. Even if we keep all 5 of those, that still leaves us at 50. We got to pick up something, take away something. Our best shot is Nevada, where we not only have a good candidate, but we also have a good candidate for governor. And the combination of the Republican Senate candidate from Reno and the Republican gubernatorial candidate from Las Vegas, I think each is going to lend strength to the other. So I think Adam Laxalt wins there. And then the question is, do we have a shot in Georgia? The answer is yes, though it may take until December 6th because there's a runoff provision there if nobody gets 50%. And who comes in first and who comes in second on Tuesday matters a lot. And then in Arizona, where we have a similar circumstance like Georgia, and one of the reasons that Herschel Walker has a good chance to win is because Brian Kemp, the Republican governor, is running a strong race and will probably beat Stacey Abrams by a healthy margin. And how many people are going to vote for the conservative governor and then turn around and vote for the very liberal senator? So there's going to be some gravitational influence there. And the same thing may happen in Arizona. Kari Lake, who is a firebrand of a candidate, is leading the rather lackluster Democratic gubernatorial candidate. And frankly, Mark Kelly, the Democrat Senate candidate, has run a surprisingly inept campaign. He had an awful lot of money. He had, free run until the Republican primary in August. He could have used a bunch of that money to create an image of himself as a Democrat, but a maverick. And instead, he just sort of reinforced what people already knew about him, that he'd been an astronaut, that he was Gabby Gifford's husband, and that he'd served with distinction in the military. And instead of, sort of saying, well, but I've broken with the administration on X, Y, or Z. So in the debate, their first debate, he then clumsily breaks from the administration on the border, but he missed the opportunity to do that early on.
What about some of these outliers? New Hampshire, which is Maggie Hassan, not a very popular sitting senator there. But then the ones that really would seem to be a stretch, but where some polls have suggested things are closer, like Washington State, for instance, or maybe Colorado. Where do you see things there?
Well, first of all, Washington State and Colorado, we have two of the best candidates in two of the toughest states. I mean, we're talking about, in the case of Washington State, a very blue state that has not elected a Republican senator in several decades, and Colorado, which is a blue state with purplish inclinations occasionally. But our two candidates, Tiffany Smiley in Washington State and Joe O'Dea in Colorado, are two terrific human beings with compelling life stories and unbelievably effective communicators. Full disclosure, I've done a couple of fundraisers for Joe O'Dea, and my wife was so taken with Tiffany Smiley that we were at an event in Washington where she was speaking, that my wife immediately sat down and wrote her out a check. But they're tough states. Now, surprises happen, and waves sometimes sweep in people who are unexpected victors, as we saw, for example, in 1980. But those are tough uphill climbs, but we got two very effective candidates. New Hampshire's an interesting race. A very sage observer told me the other day something I think is true about it. Not certain that Don Baldock can win it, but Maggie Hassan can lose it. By that meaning that Maggie Hassan has not been a particularly effective candidate. And at the end of the day, people might just sort of conclude, well, the race is close. I think we ought to have a change. I'm not certain about that Baldock guy, but I'm going to vote for him just because I want to have change. And that could happen. I will say Hassan, who's been running again at one of these, everything's all about abortion, has now here in the final stages begun to run an ad talking about inflation. She talks about the Inflation Reduction Act, but never mentions the name of the bill. She simply talks about some of its provisions, which I thought was a savvy way of doing it, unlike the president, who goes out there and repeats the name frequently and causes people to be reminded of all the press commentary that it doesn't really reduce inflation. But yeah, those are three races we need to watch on election night. And if there is a big wave, there could be some surprises in those contests and the Arizona contest.
We're going to take a break now. Sit tight. And when we come back, more with Karl Rove.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel. I'm here with Karl Rove. Well, you mentioned some of these governor's races, and this is where I have been most fascinated the last couple of weeks, because if you look around, some of the really big ones where Democrats were really placing some bets, your home state of Texas, for instance, Florida, Georgia, the incumbents there are just cruising to reelection. They've got huge leads in the poll. Abbott in Texas, DeSantis in Florida, obviously Kemp in Georgia. But what's been interesting to me is the significant number of Democratic states where there are governors where the polls are suggesting that they could be in trouble. And this was simply not the case if you were looking at it about a month ago. And now we've had some debates coming at it, but I'm thinking of places like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, New Mexico, Oregon, my home state of Oregon. By the way, we haven't elected a Republican to the governorship there since I think I was in grade school, Nevada. So what's going on there? And I have to wonder and have to think this is really where the crime issue and the education issues are coming into play, because while sometimes those are kind of vague issues to pin on federal races, because crime's a local issue, education's a local issue, they very much are at play when you come to statewide offices. And it would seem that some of these governors are really getting a lot of pushback now from voters on the lockdowns that kept their kids at home, at the rising crime that you're seeing all across areas, not just in cities, but in suburban areas too. Do you agree with that assessment, or am I missing something? What's accounting for these close gubernatorial races?
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And I think you're spot on in putting it into COVID, because COVID lockdowns caused a lot of children who didn't get in-class instruction to fall behind, and parents understand that. And it also did damage to these generally blue state economies. That's why I think Michigan is in play. And I think the Republicans are going to end up taking Wisconsin, in part because it's sort of the reverse effect of Georgia. Rather than Tim Michel, the Republican candidate for governor, it may get swept in them because Ron Johnson beats the governor Mandela Barnes by enough of a margin to swing him in. So I couldn't agree more with you. And it's interesting, we have the weird dynamic in your old home state, Vic Atiyeh. I remember meeting that guy. In 1982 was the last Republican governor of Oregon, and yet I think that the former Republican leader in the House, Strassel, has got a good chance. She's got an excellent chance of winning. But again, you're right. I mean, Sheriff Lombardo in Nevada, here's a guy who's from Clark County, Las Vegas, a well-respected, chief law enforcement officer, and he's making the case that the lockdowns of Governor Sisolak hurt school children and hurt the Nevada economy. Same argument is being made by Rochetti in New Mexico. So I think the last victims of COVID may include a couple of Democratic governors.
Well, let's turn it over to the House. And in particular, we can talk a little bit about how many House pickups Republicans might be poised to get. It obviously seems much more certain that they come out with control there, especially given the polls. But I wanted to use this to narrow in on a topic that gets some play, but I think it could end up being a really big shocker this election. And that is the shift in some minority voters, just because that seems to magnify in particular in some of these House districts, also statewide districts too. Just you were mentioning Nevada. This is a fascinating number. If you look at Nevada, about 20% of the electorate there is Hispanic. Back in the last presidential election, CNN had an exit poll showing that Biden supposedly won the Hispanic vote by about 26 points. But the latest poll out of there suggests that Cortez Masto, the woman who's running for re-election as a Democratic senator, only has a 5-point lead. And we're seeing more evidence of this come across, but it seems as though it could have a particularly outside influence in certain districts. I'm thinking in particular some of those border districts in Texas, but also places in California and other parts of the Southwest. What are you seeing out there in terms of minority voters? And it strikes me that at least some of this comes down to the fact that the Republican Party, and I've been really interested to see this, is just putting a lot more into outreach these days, because it's finally settled on them that these are groups of people, they're not monolithic voters, and they are up for grabs.
Yeah, you have to give Kevin McCarthy a lot of credit for this. The Republicans are running the most diverse ticket they have run, I think, maybe in history. I want to say 37 Latina candidates, a bunch of Asian Americans, African Americans. We're about ready to elect Wesley Hunt to the U.S. Congress from a white majority district in Houston. John James is going to get elected from Michigan. But yeah, absolutely. The Republican Party awakened to the fact that these communities were up for grabs and that the Republicans would be better off by finding highly qualified members of the community to run. We got 3 Latinas running in South Texas. They all have a good shot at winning. I suspect we'll win at least 2. We could win all 3. And it helps. I mean, we have a district I went over and did a couple of fundraisers for Juan Ciscomani in Tucson. I mean, talk about the American dream personified. Born in Mexico, parents legally migrated to the U.S. when he was a small child, became a U.S. citizen, served in the military with distinction, has been an aide to Governor Ducey, and is a fantastic human being. Wife is a Stanford graduate, 6 kids, a really fine human being. And the Republicans have, finally awakened to the fact that if you're going to be campaigning in the Hispanic community, it's better if you can find a Latino to run under the party's banner. It's so much better. So they're doing that all across the country. And as a result, we're going to have a very diverse freshman class. And I think it's going to be of great advantage to the party, not only in this election, but for years to come.
Well, if the election was tomorrow, what do you think would happen? How many seats would Republicans get?
Well, the average since the 1930s in a midterm has been 28 seats. I don't think it's going to be 28 because something weird happened in 2020, and that is that Republicans lost the White House but gained 14 seats in the House.
Yeah.
That happens only about a fifth of the time when a party loses control of the White House, does it gain seats in the House? Only about 1 out of every 5 times that happens. But we not only gained, but we gained a healthy number. So that gave us a head start. I'm thinking that it's going to be between 20 to 25, but I was leaning towards 20 a week or two ago. I'm leaning more towards closer to 25. But look, this is the thing about wave elections. When they get going, if they get going, weird things happen. And again, credit to Kevin McCarthy. The Congressional Leadership Fund raised, I think it was $78 million in the last quarter. And they have rapidly deployed that money in a lot of districts that are Biden +4, Biden +5, Biden +6, Biden +8, trying to expand the playing field and elect some Republicans in vulnerable territory. In fact, Friday, they put money into districts that were like +10, +15, +20 Biden, where they think they have a terrific candidate.
Okay, well, on that, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to go first myself and give you time to think. But I want you to name what could be the biggest upset in the House. My own pick is going to be Sean Patrick Maloney, who is the DCCC head, but he has suddenly found himself in a very tough race in New York against a GOP assemblyman named Michael Lawler. Democrats recently announced, the DCCC said it was putting $605,000 in ads to try to save him. He could squeak it out in the end, but that could be one to watch on Tuesday night. Where would you be watching?
Well, I hate to say it, but I'm watching the same race. Mike Lawler flipped a Democratic state assembly seat. He and I have been friends for a while, and I did a Zoom fundraiser for him. He is one competitive dude. And you're right. I mean, to me, it was amazing. About 2 weeks ago, Sean Patrick Maloney was literally in London, Geneva, and Paris, whooping it up with the Democrats abroad to raise money for the DCCC, rather than attending to his new Hudson Valley district. This is not his old congressional district. He opted to run in another district where he thought it would be more amenable to him, but he's run into a buzzsaw in the form of Lawler, who is a terrific campaigner with a lot of Democratic support and a lot of independent support. And so I'm going to be watching that race. If I had to pick one other, I'd be watching Alan Fung in Rhode Island. Again, a friend of mine, popular mayor of Cranston, the second most populous city in the state. He actually won the district when he ran for governor a couple of years ago, and I think he'll be terrific. He'd be, the first Rhode Island Republican in nearly 30 years, I guess it is.
And it should be said that when Sean Patrick Maloney decided to go run in that district, he also gazumped a couple of other people, set up a whole big fight there over who was going to be in what districts, and left New York pretty much a big mess. So it'll be really fun to watch how this comes out.
Exactly. Mondelaire Jones, I think, was the Democrat congressman he displaced, who actually his district was mostly or much of this district. And Mr. Jones decided to run on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, move south and run there, and lost the primary. So he's been lost to the Democratic caucus in the House, and there's bad blood there. There's no doubt about it.
Well, okay, last question here. Let's say Republicans do manage to get the House, maybe the Senate. What can they do? Because people are really frustrated by inflation. They're really frustrated by the high price of gas. They're angry about other economic issues. There's some real concern we could be headed into a recession. And while Republicans can, maybe put up a stop sign to preempt further spending that could make it worse, how much can they really do to turn things around? Are they going to end up in a situation where they promise a lot, can't deliver? I mean, what do you see a GOP agenda being if they have congressional control?
Well, first of all, you're right. They won't have veto-proof Congress, but nonetheless, they've got leverage. They, first of all, have the budget. So they can, by affecting the amounts, by spending more on the military and less on social issues, they can affect the outcomes, policy outcomes. They can attach riders. They can say, we're appropriating money for the Interior Department, but it is incumbent upon the Interior Department to return the leasing levels to oil and gas leases to the same level that they were in, pick a 5-year period, 2014 through 2019, that kind of thing. So they got leverage, and a president can't kill all of that. The second thing I'd say, though, is I do think that there are going to be some areas of the Congress, for example, China or tech, where Republicans are going to try and roll out legislation that gains enough votes to be seriously considered in the Senate, pass it through the House, but hopefully in a way that gets some Democratic votes, but puts it over in the Senate where it's got a shot of drawing some support. And there are going to be some issues like China and tech where there may be a consensus available, but there may be other issues, financial services, the economy, government reform, where the Republicans can come up with legislation that smart Democrats to say, well, you know what, I really ought to vote for that. Maybe I'm too optimistic about it, but I'm talking to members who are going to have some of that responsibility. That's clearly what they're going to try and get done. But the Republican majority will have the ability to influence the president. If a president wants to get things done, whether it's his appointments or certain policy elements, then he's got to treat with the Republican majority in the House and Senate.
Yeah, and it strikes me on that question of whether or not you can get some bipartisanship will maybe come down to a question of how big of a thumping there is in this election, of whether that then encourages what centrist Democrats remain after this election. Some of them may get wiped out, but those that are still there, they have been on a pretty big kamikaze mission over the last couple of years, doing anything that their progressive bosses have told them to do, even though it's not been in their own political self-interest. But that calculation might change if there is, a pretty big midterm trouncing. So I guess we'll have to see. Karl, I love you for your wisdom. Thank you so much for your time. We'll have to do this again. It was fun. And meanwhile, we thank our listeners, and we want to remind them that we are here every weekday, and you can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. Thanks for listening to another edition of Potomac Watch.